Crazy, nonsensical storylines, a sharp decline in viewing figures, chaos behind the scenes, last-minute rewrites, and uncertainty regarding the future of the show and its current leading actor caused this to be the season that almost destroyed Doctor Who forever. I am, of course, talking about Season 6 of the classic era, which was Patrick Troughton's last in the title role. What season did you think I was talking about? Though it features some of the most iconic on-screen moments in Doctor Who's history, off-screen several behind-the-scenes disasters meant that the threat of cancellation loomed large for television's favourite Time Lord. My name's Ruby, aka Hoobie Jones, that's Petrol the Dalek, and you're watching the story of the season that almost destroyed Doctor Who. After surviving the near impossible transition of lead actors from William Hartnell to Patrick Troughton, by the late 60s, Doctor Who was on very thin ice. The budget and cast had been stretched to breaking point, and the threat of cancellation loomed large over the final outings of the Second Doctor. In 1965, Doctor Who frequently enjoyed ratings of over 10 million viewers, sometimes even reaching 13 million. But by the time of the finale of Season 5, ratings were down to a measly 6.5 million viewers. Troubles for Season 6 began very early on with the debut story of the season, The Dominators. Producer Peter Bryant and script editor Derek Sherwin were not happy with the 6-part script submitted late by Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln. To fix this, Derek Sherwin performed some very crafty rewrites, trimming the overall story down to 5 parts, which were then broadcast between August the 10th and September 7th, 1968. Whilst this solved the problem regarding lack of interesting plot and content in The Dominators, it created a huge issue, as now there was a 1-episode gap that needed to be filled in the season schedule. With budgets for each story already allocated and spent in most cases, the production team needed to create an episode of Doctor Who essentially entirely for free, with no other cast aside from the TARDIS team of the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe. This meant that there was no money to have any sets built or even create any monsters. To get around this, Derek Sherwin crafted an incredibly spooky prologue episode to Peter Ling's 4-part story, The Mind Robber. The episode was filmed in the TARDIS interior set, as well as just against a simple plain white background, with the robot monster costume simply being borrowed from another BBC show titled Out of the Unknown. Patrick Troughton, already feeling the strain of having to shoot 40 plus episodes a year, was not happy and complained about the prospect of a whole 20 plus minute episode having to be carried by just 3 regulars. As a result, each episode was trimmed down ever so slightly to reduce the burden on the leads. This meant that episode 5 of The Mind Robber is the shortest episode in the show's history, running at just 18 minutes in length. After 2 consecutive stories with entirely new villains, Season 6's 3rd story was set to feature the main recurring villain of Troughton's era with the return of the Cybermen in The Invasion. Though this story saw the official creation of Unit by Derek Sherwin and became the template for many Earthbound adventures to follow, the original plan for The Invasion was very different to what we ended up with on screen. Sources vary as to the exact episode count, but The Invasion was originally scheduled to be a simple 4-parter or a 6-part adventure to be followed up by the story The Dream Spinner. Writer Paul Wheeler originally submitted his script The Dream Spinner during the tail end of the William Hartnell era, and reworked it and resubbed it as a 6-part adventure for Season 6. Very little is known about the plot of this serial, as after Wheeler submitted episode 1 of the adventure to the production office, it was deemed unsatisfactory and officially scrapped. This meant that The Invasion had to be padded out to 8 episodes, and as had become the norm after The Invasion was finished, the team simply carried on with what was to be the next story of the series with The Prison in Space. Now by this point into the series, producer Peter Bryant was becoming concerned that some of the stories had become a little too serious, so commissioned writer Dick Sharples to create a comedy story which would eventually become The Prison in Space. As mentioned earlier, Pat Troughton had become incredibly exhausted by the show's intense production schedule, and because of all this, as well as to avoid typecasting, he decided that Season 6 would be his last as the Doctor. The Prison in Space was originally also going to be Fraser Hines' final serial as the character Jamie, as he was going to depart midway through the season. He then changed his mind and decided to see the season right to the end with his best buds Troughton and Wendy Padbury, which meant that the Prison in Space had to be heavily rewritten again for Jamie to stay in the TARDIS. Now, what is the Prison in Space about, and why didn't it get made? I first heard of this serial as Fraser Hines briefly mentioned it in a Doctor Who documentary. He mentioned that they were going to be prisoners for these female prison guards and joked that he was really looking forward to it. But when I actually read about what it was going to be about, I couldn't believe it. The story would take place on a planet where women had ruled for many centuries and had found a way to extend their lifespans in such a way that men were no longer required. The Doctor, Jamie and Zoe were to have been put in prison and through a string of gags and set pieces would escape in a hilariously over-the-top way. The rest of the production team and director David Maloney rightfully hated this script as they saw it as a rubbish, thinly veiled critique of second-wave feminism. Particularly sketchy and problematic moments they didn't like included a scene of Jamie McCrimmon dressing up in drag to slip past a guard, and another moment where Jamie would spank Zoe to break her out of her so-called feminist brainwashing. Thankfully, the Prison in Space was axed at the very last minute, and it just so happened that there was an emergency replacement story ready to go in front of the cameras with the Crotons, written by a newcomer to the show by the name of Robert Holmes. The cast and crew, however, were less than pleased with this adventure. It was called A Horrible Story with Cardboard Cutout Monsters by Fraser Hines, and an absolute disaster by director David Maloney. But it was at least an episode that could be shot and made it to screen, so that's something. For a brief period, it seemed like the show was finally back on track, as episode 1 of the Crotons had the highest ratings of any Patrick Troughton episode at a cozy 9 million viewers. The next story in the season, The Seeds of Death, almost went off without a hitch and saw the return of the Ice Warriors. The only problem was that the script had been written under the assumption that Fraser Hines would have departed the show during the Prison in Space. Brian Hale's original script featured the Doctor, Zoe and new companion Nick. Thankfully, a swift rewrite by the new script editor Terence Dicks sorted this one right out and it got to screen with no real hitches. Next up came what Patrick Troughton later referred to as one of his favourite stories to make in The Space Pirates. Aside from starting life as a 4-parter then being extended to 6 episodes, production once again seemed like it was finally back on track, and with just 2 stories to make until the end of the season, what could possibly go wrong? After completing the necessary rewrites of The Seeds of Death, our new boy Terence Dicks met with producer Peter Bryant, who was to be the bearer of some very bad news. Not one, but 2 whole stories, a 6-parter and a 4-parter, had fallen through at the last minute and a replacement script was urgently needed. Bryant's solution was to create a 10-part story and told Terence Dicks that he had 2 weeks to go away and write it. Understandably overwhelmed, Dicks called his friend and writing mentor Malcolm Hulke and asked him to co-write what would become the War Games. What's so crazy about this story is that when the pair started writing it, they didn't even know whether Troughton would be leaving at the end of it. Because time was so incredibly short, they were churning out an entire episode every single day to get the epic finale cobbled together. Terence Dicks later in life was very critical of the serial, describing the beginning and the end being quite good, but it being 5 parts too long and an absolute nightmare to put together. Miraculously, the pair completed their impossible assignment and turned in what would become the final story of Patrick Troughton's original run. After such a rocky patch in terms of actually getting scripts onto the screen, the BBC was less than impressed with how one of their flagship shows was being run. There was a general feeling that perhaps maybe all of this was a sign that Doctor Who had just run its course, and there was an effort to think of a new programme that could maybe take its place. But according to Terence Dicks, Doctor Who was saved because the BBC simply couldn't think of anything else to replace it, and came up with the compromise that to save money the next season would see much longer serials, as well as having the Doctor exiled to Earth to save a few quid. On June the 21st, 1969, the production team and the BBC breathed in a collective sigh of relief as episode 10 of the War Games was broadcast. The season, which had seen so many false starts, missed opportunities, and even almost got Doctor Who completely cancelled, was finally over. The future once again seemed bright for the show, as it was about to transition from the spooky black and white of the 60s into the vibrant colour of the 1970s, with John Pertwee at the helm of the TARDIS. Though in that single year everything that could possibly go wrong did, we as Who fans should take it as a lesson that no matter how dire things get with our favourite show, things can and will always get better just in the nick of time. What's your favourite story from season 6, and what unproduced episode would you like to have seen most on screen? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you to my awesome Patreon member Autumn Matthews for making this video possible. If you want to support the channel and get your name in the credits of all future videos, click the link in the description below to support me on Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the official Who Be Jones YouTube channel.